I'm going to talk a little bit. If you read the description in the newspaper of what I was going to talk about, that's wrong. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Indivisible at the beginning, and then perhaps have time to talk about it a little bit at the end. And I'm happy to take any questions on it. But I was talking with my co-facilitator of Indivisible, and we sort of felt as though, well, if you want to know about Indivisible, you should come to an Indivisible meeting. But briefly, if you don't know what Indivisible was or is, it was an organization that was started after the 2016 election, the days following it, by congressional staffers who basically put together a 60-page document that said, if you want to stop the disastrous agenda which is coming our way, this is how you are going to have to go about it. It detailed how to make phone calls, how to put pressure onto your members of Congress, how to make visits to their offices, these sorts of things. Essentially, people power updated to 2016. They took a lot of their influence from the Tea Party. They said the Tea Party has been very successful in this country at electing Republicans at every level of government, and essentially clearing the way to be able to put in, I'm actually not allowed to say the president's name in my house, so we call him Voldemort. So I may refer to Voldemort a few times by accident, but you know who I'm talking about. Indivisible has since evolved past that idea of using Tea Party tactics, and we're developing our own tactics. There are over 6,000 chapters now in the United States. It's by far has become the largest progressive organization in the country, although we're still growing, we're still evolving. Obviously, we have our attention paid to 2018 and to the November election. Very specifically, we have a lot of attention that we're focusing on Bruce Poliquin and replacing Bruce Poliquin, and we're part of a national strategy, part of the 435 strategy to take back the House. It's incredibly important that we take back the House, because that's where Mueller's report will land when he gives a report, and that's where articles of impeachment will begin.
This is our first time ever speaking about our lifestyle and yurts in general, so we're not polished. We're kind of doing this because Warren asked, and this is the place where it kind of started for us. We, I don't know, how do you want to start? Do you want to start?
It's a good time to figure that out.
Yeah, we should figure that out.
We figured we would start. In July of 2011, 7 years ago, Josh's mom, we were visiting her. She lives in Sullivan, and she grew up in Ellsworth, and that side of his family is from MDI. And so we were visiting her in Sullivan. We were living in New Hampshire at the time, and she said, "I think you guys would be really interested in this place." And we had never heard of the Nearings. There was nothing in our life that was remotely connected to the Nearings.
We were very not the Nearings.
So we visited, and so I took lots of pictures of things, the gardens, the ferry trail, and we happened to go out to the yurt. We'd never seen a yurt before, and we weren't really sure what to think of the yurt, but I didn't even take a picture of it. It was that.
Yeah.
I was like, what is this? I don't know. And but on the bench in the yurt was Bill Copperthwaite's book, and at the time we again didn't even really pay attention to it. I thought it was something for craftspeople, which is not at all what we were. So we had this experience, and then we went home to our life in New Hampshire, and
This is how we live.
to try to, I don't know how to like fully encapsulate what our life was, but so we lived in a cul-de-sac with about 5 pages of rules, including like, chickens, your lawn had to be a certain way, and on and on. We had 4 TVs, and we finished our basement to put an even bigger TV in the basement. I worked a very corporate, went blow dried my hair, makeup, and Starbucks Frappuccino on my way to the office in the morning. Well, Josh, he was watching Sports Center first thing, and he owned a restaurant,
And at this stage in our life, we just had this little guy, who's now that little guy, and we had started down the path of gardening. Some things had brought us.
First, before we got to the gardening, we had no connection really to food. We spent a lot of time eating.
Table there, and the proceeds from the you don't need to upstage me. It's going to happen, believe me.
It's, ironically and coincidentally, it's Peter Yarrow. Peter, we're doing a concert for the Good Life Center. You want to say hello? I'll put you on microphone.
Have you picked up the phone?
Uh-huh. Speak to us.
People listening in the audience?
They are.
Then put them on speaker.
They're on speaker.
I am on the speaker, okay. Off the
Peter, think green, Peter. Think green.
It is no for Stooky, and it was in the free zone of the happiness outside of the champion scale. Able to have a good time now. Let's get into this other mode, singing up. And together, that's all now. So I love you, oh, but I'm leaving you. And I think this is something we should do from time to time. Yay!
Okay, babe, I'll call you back.
Well, that is pretty amazing. As I was saying, Noel brought some CDs, which are, and he's donating the proceeds to the Good Life Center.
Unfortunately, Puff is not on any of them.
So, without further ado, this person obviously needs no introduction. We've all had our experiences. I mean, I can't remember a time way back when I was in college, when we were in the dorm, and Peter, Paul, and Mary were not playing in the background. Marches in Washington, Central Park, New York. They're just a part of so many of our histories, personal histories, that it's an honor to introduce him and to welcome him back to the Good Life Center. He's a part of the original group of stewards after Helen died, and he obviously knew Helen and Scott very well. And so I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren.
Yeah.
Late in '68, decided that the time had come to settle his estate. The riots of the summer were creeping into fall, so he packed his family in the car, chose to leave it all. Out on the open road, with his elbow in the breeze, he pulled his woman to him, and he gave her heart a squeeze. With a song he'd been singing, and they waved to the people that they passed. All along the highway they were winging, headed for the paradise at last. John Henry Bosworth's family on the farm, Elizabeth sitting, knitting from a ball of yarn. Kool-Aid's in the kitchen, Buttons up in a bed, Johnny takes a long pull on his pipe and lays his head back in the easy chair with a good book in his hand. He closes his eyes and thank the Lord for making him a lucky man. With a song they've been singing, and they wave to the people that they pass. All along the highway they went winging, headed for the paradise.
Well, thanks for coming. And whenever I give a talk like this, I like to get a read of the audience to start with, so I know where to start. Any fellow anarchists among us? Okay, all right, good. Anybody ever read Kropotkin? Emma Goldman? Okay, all right, good. Okay, well, let me get started, and I'll start with a question that has an obvious answer given the topic of tonight. What does Tolstoy, Camille Pissarro, John Cage, the musician, Pissarro the painter, Tolstoy the novelist, and Bertrand Russell the philosopher, what do they have in common? They're all anarchists. And Tolstoy is an interesting exception because he's the one motto you might have heard of anarchists is no gods, no masters. Well, Tolstoy is the one exception to the anarchist rule of atheism, and there's a whole school of anarchism that's based upon early Christian brotherhood that Tolstoy developed. But let me start at the beginning. Anarchism is really the flower that blooms starting with the process of individuation in the Renaissance. The Reformation inflames this process, and in 1792, there is a book published that basically begins the anarchist tradition, and it's Political Justice by William Godwin. Now, Godwin is a name that many of you are probably not familiar with, but if you lived in the late 18th century, you would have known him well. He and Edmund Burke were the two leading intellectuals in England at the time, and Burke was an opponent of the French Revolution, and Godwin was a defender of the French Revolution. When the French Revolution went south, Godwin's star sank, to the point that the poet Shelley was surprised to learn that Godwin was still alive in 1813. And Shelley knocks on his door and basically says, I have been inspired by
working on a book about folks who make the decision to go back to the land beginning in 1840 and going all the way up to the young farmers who are coming back to the land and farming organically right now. And because of that, learning more about Scott and Helen Nearing was going to be central to this task. Part of my learning about them, because unlike many of you, I didn't have the chance to know them, involved going to their archives and taking a look at the material there. At the Walden Woods Archive down in Lincoln, Mass., one of the things that I was especially eager to look at was a manuscript for a novella that Scott Nearing had written in 1913 under the pseudonym Max Worth. And the reason I was curious about this novella is that even though he spent a decade of summers at Arden, it gets pretty short shrift in the research about him. Rebecca Gould, who some of you may know or know of, wrote about it in her book, At Home in Nature, but other places there's not very much information about it at all. So I was interested, because of the kind of place that Arden was, to find out how important it was to his development, to his thinking about the good life. In order to do that, I did the research to learn about Arden and about how it came to be and what its values were. And then I kind of ground truthed the novella against that to see how much of a crossover there was between the way he was representing it and the way that its founders had imagined it. So tonight what I'll do is I'll talk for a little while about the development of Arden as a community, and then I'll switch to look at a lot of passages from the
When the Nearings were alive, I got to wander around this house a lot, and you should look at the book titles. It's a very eclectic selection. But they had a particular interest in UFOs, and there's a whole UFO section there. And Helen told me that this leftist journal in New York that Scott wrote a column for every month was just petrified that one month the column is going to be about UFOs. He never did that. So, how did I get here? How did I become an organic farmer from suburbia with a master's degree in literature? There was this point in my life, which my mother later referred to as when you went crazy, when I had read this book called Living the Good Life by Scott and Helen Nearing. And in addition to being a teacher, I was a passionate adventurer, rock climbing, whitewater kayaking, mountaineering. And there was something about what they wrote, the idea of living in the woods and growing your own food and surviving, that sounded like an adventure, which is what got me into it. I came to visit them first in 1967, and we got along very well, and I loved what they were doing up at the old place. And then in 1968, I decided, okay, we're going to bite the bullet and do this. We came over and to see him again as we were driving around visiting real estate agents. And Helen said, well, heck, they weren't using the back half of their farm. Why didn't they sell that to me? And Scott thought it was about 50 acres.
This is kind of work in progress, and I'm going to be kind of informal about it, so stop me or make a gesture or throw yourself in front of the screen if I say something that makes no sense or you want more detail or whatever. So when I arrived here at the end of June, I was chatting with my neighbor, Lola Bojo, who's here tonight, and she said, oh, I didn't realize you were an expert on the Nearing's construction method. And I thought, oh, darn. Because there are so many people in Brooksville and elsewhere who really are immersed in the Nearing's construction method, and there have been demonstrations here of the method that I've attended that were super illuminating. So I don't claim to be as immersed in the Nearings as many other people are, but so I'm not an expert on the Nearing's construction method, but my expertise is in 19th and 20th century architecture. So, having hung out in Brooksville for quite a while, I got really interested in the Nearings, and I started reading about their construction, and I'm interested in all the people who came to me at about the same time who were very inspired by the material stuff of Maine, like rock. The sculptors, like the various sculptors who came here and direct carved on granite, and people who loved to work with wood and came here and did wood sculpting. So I'm really interested in that idea of the material of the state itself kind of drawing people, and the Nearings are, of course, very central to that story. And being, having been very interested in philosophies of craftsmanship in the 19th and early 20th centuries, I thought, well, of course I'm going to read about this.